Hello everybody and welcome to the Leading Edge Detailing Online Training Academy. In this tutorial we're going to be talking about polishes and cutting compounds. We're going to learn what is the difference between a diminishing and a non-diminishing product. We're also going to be talking about all-in-one products. We're also going to understand the polishing cycle, when to use what kind of product, and how to get the most out of your paint correction depending on the paint that you're working with. Before we get stuck into what these four products in front of me are and talk about what is a diminishing and a non-diminishing product, let's first understand what polishes and compounds are. For all intensive purposes, polishes and compounds are abrasives. They are no different than sandpaper, for example, where you can have a coarse sandpaper and a fine sandpaper. And basically these abrasives captured in a liquid form are added onto your polishing pad, and you will use that abrasive to remove microscopic amounts of paint from the car that you're working on. So throughout this whole tutorial, I want you to keep in mind we're talking about abrasives, no different to sandpaper. And as with sandpaper, as I mentioned already, you have coarse sandpaper where when you start working with it, it will remove a lot of whatever it is that you're sanding, but it will leave deep scratches from its own heavy grits and its own abrasive properties. Or you will have very fine sandpaper where when you sand whatever you're working on, you're not going to be sanding much of the surface, but it's going to leave a nicer finish that is smoother with finer gashes and gouges or finer scratches. This is no different to working with polishes and compounds. An abrasive compound is going to give you more cut, but because the abrasive particles in there are so strong, it's going to leave its own scratches that you will then have to go over and polish with a finer finishing product that has lesser abrasive properties, but it will give you a better finish because just like when using a finer grit sandpaper, you're going to be having a nicer, smoother surface. But you're not going to be doing much sanding. You're not going to be removing as much paint, wood, metal, or whatever it is that you're sanding. So let's take that concept and absorb it as much as we can because it's going to help you really understand the next part of this tutorial. Now that we have addressed what a cutting compound or a fine finishing polish is, let's talk about the three main categories of products that you can find in the detailing world. You will have what is called a non-diminishing abrasive. And a non-diminishing abrasive can be a cutting compound, medium cut compound, or a finishing compound. But that product, the abrasives inside it will continue to perform in the same manner no matter how much you're using that polish. The next type of polish that we're going to be talking about is what's called a diminishing product. And by diminishing, what we mean is that when you start using this product, it's going to cut at a higher rate than normal. And then as you are continuously using up that polish or using up that compound, over the polishing cycle, those abrasive particles are going to break down into finer and finer abrasives. And what that does is it gives you a product that starts cutting like a cutting compound and breaks down into a medium compound and then eventually finishes up like a fine polish. Finally, we will also talk about all-in-one type of products, and those are generally speaking diminishing type of polishes and compounds mixed in with some sort of paint sealant or filler. The best way to understand paint correction and in particular abrasives in diminishing versus non-diminishing products is by looking at a line chart like this. On one axis you have the cutting power. So the higher you go up onto the graph, the more the product cuts. The lower you go onto the graph, the lesser the product cuts, the more it finishes. On the other axis, you have the time. So whether that's in minutes or seconds, as time progresses, we're going this direction right here. As time progresses, you're going this direction right here. Imagine you have just put some iGel F1 on a polishing pad and you're going to start polishing, and you're going to be polishing for 60 seconds. Let's work on the time of 60 seconds. Where are we? 60. And please mind my writing. It's very new for me to use a stylus. We're going to be putting some iGel F1 on a yellow pad and we're going to be polishing for 60 seconds. And that's probably going to look like this. So as you're polishing, the IGL F1 is going to continue cutting in a specific manner. Now let's have a look at IGL F3, and on the same pad, a yellow pad. It's also going to continue cutting in the same manner, but it's going to give you less cut. And this is what we call a non-diminishing product, because it doesn't matter how much you're polishing for, the cutting power or the abrasive power remains consistent. Those abrasive particles are going to remain consistent until they dry up and clog up, or until your pad overheats. And that's where you can sort of spray a little bit of water and restart those abrasive particles and continue polishing. What is different, however, is when you have a diminishing product. And what we mean by diminishing product, like let's say IGL F2, is the product will begin cutting high. So let's say it begins cutting here, and as the polishing cycle continues, it's going to break down into finer and finer abrasives until it basically starts doing nothing. Any diminishing product will begin cutting high, and those abrasive particles will break down, and that product will start cutting less and will start finishing more, which is really fantastic, because if you think about it, you're getting the benefit of the heavy cutting product and the benefit of the finishing product in one go. So you're saving yourself half the time. Basically, you're saving yourself, you'll be doubling your time if you're doing 2 stages instead of 1 stage. And that's what it means by 2-stage paint correction. You have your first stage here, you have your second stage here, and you're basically polishing the car twice. So IGL yellow pad with F1 looks like this, IGL yellow pad with F3 looks like this, and IGL yellow pad with F2 looks like this. And this all looks fantastic. However, where you will need to consider a 2-stage paint correction as opposed to a single-stage paint correction with a diminishing product is when you're dealing with paint that is very hard or has heavy defects or very soft. So let's assume you're dealing with paint that is very hard, and this is 60 seconds. So really, to get maximum defect removal, you need to cut heavily for 30 seconds. So 30 seconds is right here on this chart. As you can see, if you're using IGL F2, it's going to have lost its abrasive abilities by the time you get to that 30-second mark. So really, you're going to have to do multiple passes of a diminishing product to get the desired cut. Where with a non-diminishing heavy cutting product, continue that polish, and you're going to use less product, you're going to use less time, because you're going to consistently cut at a level you need. This is where you need to really be careful, because people get sucked into a bad habit of only using diminishing products, not realizing that it's actually less time efficient to do 5 or 6 or 10 passes of a diminishing product to get the desired result, as opposed to doing 2 passes with a non-diminishing and doing a proper 2-stage paint correction and getting the best cut and the best polish in doing 2 goes instead of 5 or 6 goes of a diminishing product. The same thing can be said for very soft paint or paint that doesn't really need a lot of cutting. So let's say, for example, you only need 20 seconds or 10 seconds, let's say 10 seconds of polishing time or cutting time to really get the desired result on soft paint. So here's, for this sake, 10 seconds. And if you're using IGL F3, you are finishing for 10 seconds and you're getting really nice, non-hazy, very glossy paint. But if you're using a diminishing product, to get the same finish as IGL F3, you need to run the machine for, let's say, 30 or 40 seconds. And you are unnecessarily cutting a lot to get to where you need to then start polishing and finishing. So really, you're going to almost need to run the machine for probably an extra 10, 20, 30% and risk burning through paint to get the same finish as you would if you just jump onto your 2nd stage paint correction straight away. So this is where you really need to take into account what you're doing. And I always like doing my test panels with a diminishing product, because if you could use the diminishing product as your test bed with a medium pad and get a perfect result, happy days. You have just saved yourself a lot of time and money and headache. But if you are doing a test spot with IGL F2 or any diminishing product and you're not getting the desired cut or you're not getting the desired finish, don't waste your time. Go straight to a two-stage paint correction, IGL F1, IGL F3. Now let's talk about the next most important thing, and it's going to have its own tutorial, but because we have the chart up, it's really good to understand how it works, and that is your pad choice. So let's say, hypothetically speaking, you want to cut more, and we're going to change the IGL yellow pad to an IGL wool pad or an IGL microfiber pad. All you're doing is you're literally moving everything up. So let's say with a microfiber pad, an IGL F1, the cutting will be at this level. The cutting will also be at this level for the diminishing, which is F2. And the finishing will be at this level when you do a more aggressive pad. So everything becomes more aggressive because you have changed the pad to a more aggressive pad. Going back to the example of IGL F2, if you're working on a car that has very hard paint, you can use a more aggressive pad and it will cut more, but you just need to be careful that it will finish good enough on that hard paint for it to still be a single stage. On the other side, however, if you pick a softer pad, so if you go for a black pad in the IGL range, you're moving everything down. So you're pretty much getting less cut but better finish on every single product that you're working on. So it's a lot of lines, it's a lot of information to take on board, but the most important thing you need to understand is what will be the most efficient to get you the desired result. If you can get away with a single stage paint correction using a diminishing product, and diminishing products are always a compromise. They will not cut as good as a non-diminishing cutting compound, and they will not finish as good as a very fine non-diminishing polish, but you will get, I would say, 80% of best of both worlds. So always go for the diminishing first if that is going to give you the desired result. If that doesn't work, don't waste your time doing multiple passes using diminishing products. Go straight to the non-diminishing, do a two-stage paint correction, IGL F1, IGL F3. If you're finding that you're not cutting good enough with IGL F1, up the pad. So go to a more aggressive pad, go to wool, microfiber, whatever you need to. If you're not getting the desired finish with IGL F3, go to a softer pad. And also consider other techniques such as machine speed, machine pressure, your polishing cycle. You might not need to go for the full 60 seconds. Also your angle and your heat and other things like that. So I hope this has clearly explained the difference between diminishing and non-diminishing products and when to use them. The all-in-one kind of products are diminishing, but they also include fillers and waxes. Let's now talk about how to use these products, when to use them, and I guess combinations and little tricks. Obviously, if you're doing a heavy cut, there is a car with deep defects, the paint is thick, you want to remove as much defect as you can, and you know you're not going to get the best finish possible, or you are understanding that you might have to go and do a second stage to bring back that gloss, use IGL F1. Ideally with the appropriate pad, which we will talk about in its own tutorial. If you are then using IGL F1, or if your paint you're working on is very soft or the defects are not very deep, that's when you use a product like IGL F3. So you want that beautiful gloss enhancement, you're removing very light marring, you're removing maybe some high spots, use IGL F3, or otherwise you're removing haze created by the heavier cutting product like IGL F1. These two are fairly easy and simple to understand. Where the diminishing compounds really comes into play is when you're time limited and you're trying to pick the best compromise between these two. So a diminishing product will sometimes not give you the same result as having a proper non-diminishing cut and a proper non-diminishing finish, because you might need more cut. You might need to be cutting for 2 minutes, where this will only give you cutting for 30 seconds. But it will save you a lot of time in that you're getting the action of 2 types of polishes and 2 cycles of polishing in one. So where you're doing what's called a single stage paint correction, or you're time limited, or the car is not necessarily too good or too bad, This is where you can really shine with iGel F2 and other diminishing products, especially if the paint is hard towards medium, where you need a good initial cut, more work in the middle range, and finishing is pretty good but not incredibly soft. You can save a lot of time. You can save probably half of your time using a product like iGel F2 because it will do the job of both of these together. When you don't use iGel F2, however, is when you need that consistency. So if you're working on a very hard car with very deep defects and hard paint, you might need to continue that cutting cycle for much longer, and you must use a product like iGel F1 instead of iGel F2, because if you use iGel F2, the abrasives are going to break down too soon for you to then get the desired cut. And on the other side of the spectrum, if you're working on cars with soft paint, you don't want to be using a product like iGel F2 because the heavy cut at the start is unnecessary, and you're creating more work for you to then remove the defects that the heavy cutting of the F2 before the abrasives break down is going to be creating. So you need to really jump straight into a product like iGel F3. And as I mentioned, the all-in-ones like iGel F4 and a few other brands, that's going to be more so for your quick and easy polish, easy wipe off and send it away. Let's make it nice and glossy, rather than your permanent kind of paint correction work where you will then use a product like iGel Pre-Coat, remove anything that might be hiding defects, and then adding a ceramic coating. So these are the three types of polishes in the market. You will be able to play around with them a little bit in that you can get creative and have 3 dots of iGel F2 with 1 droplet of iGel F1. You can have a few drops of iGel F3 with a few drops of iGel F2. There is no problem at all mixing and matching. The only thing is you cannot mix and match with the all-in-ones because they will contaminate your pad and will hinder the ability of these other products to work. So keep that in mind. It's also important to know that you don't necessarily have to match up the heavy cut, medium cut, finishing product and diminishing products with corresponding pad as such. So if you're working on very hard paint, you can most certainly use iGel F1 and a wool pad, but there's nothing stopping you from using iGel F1 and a medium pad, or using iGel F3 and a microfiber pad. As a detailer, you're always going to have to experiment to see what gives you the best result for the car you are working on. So use these as a tool in your arsenal and feel free to get creative. A little bit of a pro tip and pro advice for you is if you're using a product like iGel F4 or any all-in-one type of product in the market, have a separate set of pads, because this product is going to contaminate that pad. And generally speaking, and what I mean by this product, I don't mean F4, I'm talking about any all-in-one, will probably be very hard to wash out of that pad. So thank you for watching. I hope this tutorial has been helpful. It is brief but very to the point, and we're going to be talking about pads next, and hopefully by taking the knowledge in this tutorial and the other tutorial, you can start getting really creative and efficient and finding the best pad and product combination, which is generally speaking the biggest hurdle for every professional detailer to really overcome. And no matter how professional you are and how experienced you are, I see it all the time in my own Facebook groups for the iGel Australian detailers, and they're always bouncing questions and answers and ideas off each other on which pad and product combination to get the best results out of a particular car that's a problematic car, that's not playing to the normal 99% of the market, and how that paint polishes up. So thank you for watching, and I look forward to presenting the pads tutorial for you.